Welcome, brave souls, to the chilling depths of horror and detail, the realm where the shadows whisper ancient secrets and nightmares come to life. I am your guide through the darkness, and on this channel, we delve into the spine-chilling world of Skinwalker horror stories that will send shivers down your spine. First story. I think I met a skinwalker. Growing up in Arizona, myths and legends are a part of life. Native traditions, mystic places, vortexes, UFO abductions, and dozens of other stories of the unknown that I always found fascinating. I grew up spending a lot of time wandering around the desert and the mountains, hunting, camping, etc., so I felt very at home in the wilderness. One late spring day on one of my many hiking adventures, I wandered off trail and after several hours came upon a small group of old mud adobe houses. A few people heard me coming and came out of the houses to investigate, and after apparently making the collective decision that I was not a threat, one of the elders dressed in old-style, traditional native clothing and a headdress came over to greet me. The man spoke slowly and told me that I had wandered onto a Navajo reservation and asked me if I was lost, or if I needed help. When I told him no, I was lost, but intentionally, he chuckled and invited me in to eat with his family. The next several hours were one of the great experiences of my life. The whole thing was like being thrown back in time. While we ate and talked, others from the surrounding houses began coming over to join us, and I got the feeling they didn't get many outside visitors. We shared stories for hours about life, family, theater history in the area, and time spent in the wild. And the longer we talked, the more they opened up and the more interesting the elders' stories got. Throughout the time, there was one man who never spoke. He just sat out of the circle listening and watching me. At one point, I told them I did what I called my walkabouts every year around September, where I would go out by myself into the wilderness for 2 to 4 weeks at a time. And this got the attention of the one silent old man. When I finished, he came over to the circle around the fire, sat directly on the ground in front of me, and asked me to join him on the ground. He told me that years ago he used to do the same thing, and went on to tell me about the canyon he went to. He described it as a dangerous but magic place, and that I would see the world differently if I came back. If must be for dramatic effect. When he finished, he invited me over to his home. The house was small, and through an open door in the back room, I could see it was filled with various animal pelts, coyotes, and wolves mostly. He walked over and closed that door, then picked up and handed me an old map and some written directions that seemed like he had been holding on to them for a long time, and just walked away into that back room and closed the door behind him. It was late, and one of the families had invited me to stay the night, which I gladly did. The next morning, as I prepared to leave, one of the old women came over to me with something in her hands, handed me a talisman, and simply said, "Dip your bullets in the white ash at the hottest part of the fire," then just walked away. September came, and as I packed for my walkabout, I saw the talisman in a drawer and something felt right about taking it with me. After a beautiful drive, I was very happy to find the Forest Service road marked on the old map. The entrance to the area was remote and overgrown, and tough to get to even in my Jeep, and took me much longer to get to than expected. So I decided to make camp and start the hike in the morning. After a few hours on a trail that looked like it had been forgotten, I came to a stream and the entrance to the secret valley. It was a narrow crack in the tall cliffs with about 4 feet of water running gently through, but too narrow for a kayak or canoe. I hoisted my gear over my head and began the wade sideways through the chest-deep water. The crack in the cliffs seemed to go on forever, but after almost 2 hours I came to the place where it opened up into a small lake in an incredible valley surrounded by tall rock faces. This may have been the most remote place I have ever been, in the sense that there was no sign that people had ever been there. No trash, no bullet casings, not even the evidence of campfires. My first night there was the quietest night I have ever spent in the wild. No birds, no frogs, not even crickets, but I didn't feel like I was alone there. In the morning, after breakfast, I headed out on my first exploratory hike to explore my new home for the next couple weeks. After being stalked by a mountain lion on a hike about 10 years ago, I make a point of now bringing a pistol with me when I'm out wilderness hiking. After some looking around, I found a narrow path that appeared to be a game trail that led up the side of one of the cliffs and towards what looked like caves from the canyon floor. I made my way up to them and came upon an entrance that was much larger than it appeared from below. I made some noise to alert any possible animals I was there and made my way inside. The cave was an expansive single chamber that went back a couple hundred feet. As I walked, I inspected as much as I could see with my light, but there was no tracks of any kind in the dirt besides mine, so I decided I was alone in there and pushed on towards the rear of the cave. As I came around the last bend in the cave and approached the end, my headlamp panned across a large pile of bones, some animal, some human, and a very old-looking, small candle sitting on a natural stone shelf. This is the first thing that has scared me in as long as I can remember, but focusing my wits I remembered that there was no other tracks in the cave, and figured it was all from a long time ago. I was still a little uneasy as I exited the cave, and was ready to get back to camp. As I came out into the light, about 75 feet away, there was the largest wolf I have ever seen that looked like it was coming down from standing on its hind legs. It dropped down to all fours on a rock, just began staring at me, not growling or baring its teeth, just staring. I pulled my .45 and fired 2 shots up to the side of it to scare it away, but it didn't even flinch. Not only have I never seen a wolf in this part of northern Arizona, but I have never seen a wild animal that did not at least flinch at the sound of a gunshot. We both stood there staring at each other for a moment. I turned and set my backpack down to grab my binoculars and get a little closer look, but when I turned back, the wolf was gone. I made my way cautiously down the path back towards camp. I have encountered wolves before, and usually it's not the one wolf you can see that should worry you. It's the ones you can't see, so I was extra cautious for the return trip. Back at camp, I made sure my gun was fully loaded, and got my recurve bow strung just in case the wolves came back. I have seen plenty of predatory animals on my adventures. It's a part of being in the wilderness. So I wasn't too worried, just prepared myself the best I could and went over to the lake to go fishing. Within about 20 minutes, I caught 2 of the biggest brown trout I've ever caught, so I decided to stop fishing for the day and take a swim. Back at camp, I made a fire, cleaned my trout, and made dinner while the sun went down. As soon as the sun went down, all of the life in the canyon seemed to go silent again. As I put out my fire and prepared for bed, I noticed there was a small flicker of light coming from the area where the cave I had explored earlier up the cliffside, which didn't make sense. It was a moonless night, and stars don't reflect that way. It couldn't have been the candle I had seen. It was too old and would not have burned so bright. I decided to keep my gun close and try to get some sleep. I would investigate the cave again the next day. When I woke at sunrise, there was a haze along the ground throughout the whole canyon floor, but as the sun rose it disappeared quickly, and the area came back to life. I made my breakfast, gathered my gun and bow, and headed back up towards the cave. When I reached the entrance, I saw there were still no tracks besides mine around the entrance and decided to push up the hill further. Just a little further up, I came upon the entrance to another cave, much smaller than the first one. There was a small flat landing with a large, heavily twisted juniper tree that to my absolute surprise had many small objects hanging from thin, old-looking ropes tied to the branches. There were bones, but there were also old things definitely made by humans, and looked like they were old Native American artifacts. thinking I might have found the spot where the old man I met on the reservation had stayed when he was there decades ago. I went into the cave. This cave was much different from the first one. Just a few feet in, I noticed the walls were covered in what looked like ceremonial cave paintings. As I pushed further back, the cave got dramatically colder, much colder than it should have been, and the walls were completely covered with the paintings the entire way. When I reached the back of the cave, I was not prepared for what I saw. There was what looked like an old altar made of wood and bones. As I looked around, I saw that a little before the back of the cave, there was another shaft in the ceiling that went up, and on a ledge about 25 feet up sat the small figure of what appeared to be a woman. She was small and pale with her face painted white, and wearing something like a crown made of woven branches with two small antlers at the front. I stopped and stared for a few minutes, and the figure did not move, so I assumed that it was mummified remains from a long time ago. Not wanting to disturb a burial site, I turned to walk back out of the cave, but I began to walk. I heard what sounded like a faint voice in an unknown, ancient language. I instinctively looked back up towards the figure, but it was gone. I was immediately terrified and ran from the cave as fast as I could get out, but my headlamp flickered and died. I made my way out, feeling along the wall to find my way, and the whole way I felt like there was something right behind me. When I saw the first light from the cave entrance, I began to sprint towards it. Just before I made it out, I looked back and there was nothing, so I slowed down, but I could still hear the faint voice and the volume never changed. When I got outside, all the bones and artifacts hanging from the tree were gone. I ran down the path as fast as I could, headed back to my campsite by the lake. Just as I reached the floor of the canyon, I noticed the large wolf at the tree lean to my left, but this time it stayed standing upright on its hind legs. I stopped running, hoping to not initiate its predatory response to chase me, and again, it just stood there staring at me. I reached my campsite safely and immediately began packing up. It was too late in the day to make it out before dark, and I did not want to make the hike out at night with all that was going on. I moved my tent so it would back up to the canyon wall by the crack in the cliffside, so I didn't have to worry about anything sneaking up behind me. I built my fire much larger and knew I wasn't going to get any sleep that night. Just as the sun was going down, I began to hear noises coming from the trees, and I felt like I was being hunted. Finally, in the last light of day, I saw the wolf slowly walking around by where the path led out of the trees, and it began to slowly walk towards me. This time I drew my gun and fired towards the creature, intending to hit it, and while I saw a couple hit the dirt around it, several bullets hit it. Several rounds from a .45 will at least slow down anything I've ever encountered, but this giant wolf kept walking towards me like nothing had happened. I continued to fire at it until the inevitable click of an empty magazine. I reached down and fumbled around in my backpack looking for my other magazines to reload, and as I lifted it, the talisman the old woman gave me fell out onto the ground. I picked it up and put it around my neck and immediately remembered what she had told me. Dip your bullets in the white ash? I looked around, but didn't see my backup magazines, so I grabbed my bow, pulled an arrow that was tipped with a hunting broadhead and dipped it into the white ashes, drew and fired. I hit the creature just in front of its right hip, and it let out a noise somewhere between a growl and a person screaming that made my blood curdle. I can hear that noise in my head to this day. It immediately turned and ran back to the trees, and in the flicker of the fire light, I saw the small women with the antler crown standing there waiting for it. They both retreated into the trees, and for the rest of the night, I could hear the same faint voice I had heard in the cave. I spent the night outside of my tent, as awake as I have ever been, but no longer afraid, and at dawn finished packing up so I could get out of that canyon. The next spring, I went back to the small group of houses on the Navajo reservation I had found the year before. I was wearing the talisman as a necklace, and the first person to greet me was the woman who had given it to me, and she ran up to give me a big hug. "You heard me," was all she said. I asked the group about the man who had given me the map, as I was almost desperate to talk to him about the experience I had so I could compare it to his own. They told me that he had disappeared shortly after I had visited them the first time and had not been back. Strangely, when I tried to tell them what had happened to me, no one would let me tell the story, and the oldest man there, who sat in the corner, kept mumbling the words, "Inald Lashii." We all once again sat and shared other stories of life and a meal. Before I left the next morning, I found the old woman who had given me the talisman and offered it back to her. She smiled and told me I had a good heart, then just closed my hands around it, telling me to keep it to watch over my next walkabout. I went back to that small village on the reservation several times over the next 10 years or so till I moved to Oregon, but they never let me tell them what happened. I never went back to the canyon, and while curiosity sometimes gets the best of me, I don't think I ever will. Second story. The Singing Skinwalker. This story was told to me by one of my good friends, who's of Navajo descent on her father's side. It happened several years ago, when she was spending the last 2 weeks of summer visiting relatives on a reservation in New Mexico, and is by far one of the creepiest things I've ever heard. My friend, Jessie, was 12 at the time and playing outside with her cousins. They were tossing a frisbee around, and one of the younger kids threw it too hard. It flew over the fence and was swallowed up by a small grove of parched bur oak trees. Jessie, being the eldest, went to retrieve it, leaving her 11-year-old cousin Ellie in charge until she got back. The sun was setting, lighting up the sky in brilliant shades of orange, as Jessie made her way over to the grove. After some poking around, she found the frisbee caught in one of the tree's branches. As she climbed, she began to sing an old Navajo song, but paused when her body suddenly went cold. That's exactly how Jessie described it to me. Cold, as if she'd been dunked in ice water. You know that annoying, scary story cliché of feeling like you're being watched? Well, it's only cliché because it's true. Jessie could feel a pair of eyes following her even when she looked around her and saw nothing. Seriously creeped out, she grabbed the frisbee and ran back to her grandmother's house, just in time to see the old woman step onto the porch and call for the kids to come inside. The true horror didn't start until several hours later. Jessie, her cousin Ellie, and Ellie's little sister Clara were asleep in their grandmother's guest room when Jessie woke up to the strangest sound she'd ever heard. She described it to me as a cross between radio static and the noise an old movie reel makes. At first, it sounded distant, but after a minute or two, Jessie realized it was getting closer. Beside her, Ellie rolled over and muttered, "What is that?" "Don't know," Jessie whispered. The girls waited, holding their collective breath. By now, the sound was right outside the window, and Jessie realized it was singing. At this point in her retelling of the story, Jessie went white and began glancing over her shoulder. She told me the song was the exact same one she'd been singing in the tree grove earlier. "It sounded so wrong," she said, rubbing her arms as if a cold breeze had rushed by her. "Remember when we listened to that clip of the very first recording of a human voice? How weird it sounded." When I nodded, Jessie added, "It was like that, but a little clearer. Somehow, that made it even worse." Jessie and Ellie were both terrified, while Clara, unaware, slept on. Through the thin blue curtain over the window, they could see the dark shadow of something peering in at them. To this day, Jessie can't explain what motivated her to get up and see for herself, since she was scared shitless. Ignoring Ellie's protests, she slid out of bed and walked across the room on shaky legs. As soon as she drew back the curtain, she regretted her decision. Staring back at her was the most horrifying creature she had ever seen. It had the head of an emaciated deer, with antlers like dead tree branches and eyes so black they seemed to absorb the faint silver moonlight. It had a scrawny humanoid body with abnormally long arms and legs, and as Jessie stood there, caught in its hideous gaze, it raised a clawed hand and scratched at the window with a horrible screeching sound that made Jessie's skin crawl. It was Ellie's scream that jolted Jessie out of her terrified stupor. She stumbled back from the window and landed on the carpeted floor. Clara woke up and began screaming too. Then their grandmother ran in and turned on the light. The thing at the window had vanished, leaving behind 3 long scratches in the glass and 3 terrified little girls. Jessie's grandmother managed to calm the hysterical children enough so they could tell her what had happened. As she listened, her age-weathered face became progressively paler. She hustled the girls downstairs to the living room and made up a bed for them on the couch. She then sat by them all night, and whenever one of them asked her what was going on, the old woman simply shook her head. Needless to say, Jessie and her cousins didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, Jessie's grandmother announced that everyone was to stay inside that day. No arguments. She looked so shaken nobody dared protest. Around noon, she called for a medicine woman to come and bless the house. Later, after the woman left, Jessie marched into the kitchen where her grandmother was loading the dishwasher. "Tell me what that thing was," she said bluntly. Her grandmother sighed and motioned for Jessie to sit down. "You have heard the legend of the Skinwalkers, yes?" Jessie frowned and nodded, vaguely recalling the story. "So that was a skinwalker?" Her grandmother nodded. "Yes." "Grandma," said Jessie as a light dawned, "I think it overheard me singing in the tree grove yesterday." Her grandmother's dark eyes narrowed. "Why do you say that?" "Because it was singing that same song. You know, the lullaby you used to sing to me when I was little." Her grandmother was silent for a long time before whispering, "You are a very lucky girl, Jessica, but luck has its limits. From now on, you must be more careful." The look in the old woman's eyes as she spoke those words still haunts Jessie to this day. As I said earlier, that was years ago, 7, to be specific. Jessie has returned to the reservation many times, each without incident, but she has never set foot in that tree grove again, and probably never will. Jessie's grandmother died this past March, at the age of 87, and Jessie later moved in with her aunt for the summer so she could help clean up the old house, which the family was going to rent out. She had been there for about a week when I went down there to visit her. On my first night, we sat on the porch and drank some beers, and I found my eyes drifting towards the tree grove. "So that's where it all happened?" Jessie shuddered and nodded. "Yep. Tomorrow, I'm taking you to the medicine woman and have her bless you." "Is that really necessary?" The look Jessie gave me nearly turned me to stone. "You think nothing will happen to you because you're white. But when you're in Navajo territory, you're in Skinwalker territory. Take caution." I nodded. "Yes." That night, I swore I heard radio static outside the house. When I brought it up to Jessie the next morning, she didn't speak, but grabbed my arm and practically dragged me to the medicine woman, where I was blessed. Nothing happened for the rest of the trip, and I went back to the city unscathed. I didn't post this here with the intention of teaching a moral, but I suppose if there is something to be learned from the story of the singing Skinwalker, it's that there are things out there we can't explain. The look in Jessie's eyes when she recounted her experience told me everything I need to know. What she saw truly horrified her, and all I can say is, I'm grateful I didn't have to go through it myself. Third story. I was claimed by a skinwalker. I'm Jake, a 22-year-old male currently attending Clemson University in Clemson, South Carolina. Seeing as it's my last year at the uni before I graduate, my friends and I planned a camping trip for the last week of school. The hardest part was fitting everyone in my Jeep, but we managed. "What the hell is that, Chase?" I asked, already knowing the answer. "A blunt, duh." Chase was the stoner of our group, because every group just has to have one. He was a chubby little white boy, about 5 feet 8 inches, with brown hair pulled up in a bun and just enough chin hair to look like Shaggy from Scooby-Doo. "Damn it, man, you're not gonna hotbox my car," I exclaimed. I would shake my head in disbelief if I wasn't so used to it. "I agree with Jakey. At least save it for when we get there," Blair chimed in. Blair was the most playful one in our group, at least around me. She was about 5 feet 6 inches with fair skin, long red hair, light freckles around the bridge of her nose, and bright green eyes. "Thanks, Blair," I said with a sigh of relief. She smiled at me and went back to playing whatever choose-your-own-adventure game she had recently installed. We didn't even make it 5 minutes without another argument in my back seat. I let out another sigh. It's going to be a long week. When we arrived at the forest, I made sure to do a head count in case we lost anyone at a rest stop. Okay, there's Blair and Chase, staying as far away from each other as possible. There's Aljo. Aljo was a really muscular guy with dark skin who stood around 6 feet 2 inches, had a dark high-top hairstyle, and a well-maintained beard. And there's Corey, by far the nicest person in our group. Corey stood at 5 feet 3 inches, had caramel-colored skin, and curly brown hair that framed her face nicely. "So, Jake, what are we waiting for?" she asked in the nicest way possible. "Let's go enjoy the great outdoors." I half expected her to end up singing to the little woodland creatures on our way there. No point in delaying it any longer, I guess. While we were scouting out the forest for a good campsite, I felt strangely calm. There's just something about being in the woods that feels so serene. The birds singing their sweet songs as the sunlight reflects through the beads of dew on the leaves is just so relaxing. My moment of peace was interrupted, however. Something was off. It was just enough for you to notice, but not enough to pinpoint. I stopped walking and concentrated on finding the source of my unease. After a few moments, my ears caught it. One bird was out of sync. All the other birds were singing in perfect unison, but this little guy was half a beat behind. No one else seemed to notice it, so I just kept walking. I still thought it was a bit weird, but oh well. The little guy was probably still learning, after all. When we finally found a site we could all agree on, it was almost dark. Chase and Corey started building a campfire, while Blair, Aljo, and I began assembling the tents. "So, Jake," Aljo began, "you brought the arrows, right?" "Course, did you bring the bow?" I responded. Instead of responding, he simply tossed the bow my way. I grabbed it and tested the drawstring. It felt nice and strong, tight but reflexive. It was a beautiful maplewood bow gifted to Aljo by the Navajo tribe we had met a few years back in Utah. I set it down near his tent and got to work helping Blair set up ours. "Here, let me get that for you," I said as I hammered a tent spike down. "Thanks, Jakey," she said with a smile. "I'll go get our bags." Before she could take a step toward the car, Chase showed up in front of her. "I'll go with you then," he said with the creepiest wink I've ever seen. He has a really punchable face, I thought. "How about you just go get them by yourself?" Blair retorted with a wink of her own. Chase sighed in defeat and started off toward the car. While Chase was getting our bags from the car, the rest of us sat around the campfire. Corey was talking to Aljo with a bright smile on her face, as usual. I heard something about it being a nice night for s'mores before I was reminded of the redhead sitting next to me. "So, Jakey, you ready to spend a whole week with us?" Blair asked playfully. She said us, but I knew she was more so asking if I was ready to spend a week with her. "There's no one I'd rather be stuck with," I replied with a wink. Her eyes lit up at this and her smile grew wider, making me wonder what I had just gotten myself into. She grabbed my wrist and yanked me toward her tent. Blair, you sure this is the best time for this?" I asked hesitantly. "Oh, shut up, Jakey." She pulled me in the tent and zipped away my view of Aljo, giving me a thumbs up and Corey just staring, innocently wondering what was happening. I turned around to find Blair, tablet in hand. She held it out to me and told me to choose a game. Well, this isn't what I thought was gonna happen. I tapped on one called Not Much Time and sat down on the tent floor. She sat next to me with her head on my shoulder, and we alternated choices in the game. Apparently this one was about someone who suddenly has the power to stop time. My first choice was whether to use my power to help someone, steal from someone, hurt someone, or just restart time. I decided to help someone. But that's so boring, Jakey," Blair whined. She, of course, used her choice to hurt someone the next time we played. We ended up replaying the game 5 more times before we fell asleep. When I woke up, I could see rays of sunlight peeking in through small holes in the tent. My right arm was still asleep, so I went to move it, but couldn't. I looked over to find Blair hugging my arm like a teddy bear. I let out a sigh and gently freed my arm from her death grip. I noticed the dead tablet on the floor and plugged it into a portable charger. I unzipped the tent and walked out into the fresh pine-scented air. I thought I was the first one awake, but that thought was shattered when I noticed smoke coming from Chase's tent. Really? This early in the morning? I relit our campfire and boiled water for some oatmeal. I made sure I had enough for everyone and poured in the packets. In a few minutes, I had 2 bowls of oatmeal and headed back to Blair's tent. "Hey, Blair, I made breakfast." She was still asleep. "Hey, dummy, I got you something," I said as I nudged her with my foot. She whined about not wanting to go to school today and tried to go back to sleep. I sighed and put the bowl down in front of her face and, like a dog, she sniffed a little and opened her eyes. "Oh, hey, Jakey," she said as I rolled my eyes. I sat down next to her and ate my oatmeal. Well, I guess it could be worse. Throughout the day, we each did various chores around camp. Blair and Corey decorated everyone's tents. Chase got wood for the fire, and Aljo and I went hunting. Aljo was more familiar with the bow than I was, so I was wielding my knife. The knife, a 6-inch Bowie, made for an easy kill up close, while Aljo was our ranged predator. So far, all we had seen were rabbit and deer tracks, but neither of the animals that had left them. We set up some snares for the rabbits and decided it would be best to set up an outpost in a tree to let the deer come to us. We found a decent-sized tree and climbed up to wade in the branches. While we waited on our prey, Aljo was dead silent. I felt calm and focused, like I was a born predator on the hunt. This feeling was quickly shattered, leaving only unease in its wake. My eyes scoured the forest floor for something, anything out of place. That's when I saw it. There was a single deer grazing on the dew-covered blades of grass. As it gated to another patch of grass, I studied it for abnormalities. The problem was easy to identify, as the deer walked differently from any deer I had ever seen. Its steps were janky, uncertain almost, as if it thought the floor might give out from beneath it. It would tap the ground with its front hoof in one spot, and then stomp the same hoof down a foot away from where it tapped. As it did this, it was making a noise. It sounded almost like a low growl. Now, maybe there was an explanation for its lurching steps, but I know deer don't growl. As I thought this, The deer's head suddenly jerked up toward me and Aljo. My breath caught in my throat, and my heart lurched as violently as the deer had stepped. The deer? No. The demon was now gazing into my very soul with its bright yellow eyes. I couldn't bring myself to look away, that is, until Aljo fired an arrow into the damn thing. The thing let out the most blood-curdling screech I've ever heard before or since. It took off into the bushes, and we got the hell out of that tree. That night, we were all chilling by the campfire eating s'mores. Corey and Aljo were talking again, and really seemed to be hitting it off. I smiled at the thought of my two friends being happy together. They certainly deserved it. Chase had gone into the woods to take a leak, and should be getting back any time now. I started thinking about that deer again. What was that thing? It couldn't have been a deer. I'll try to keep you all a sadash. I was broken out of my thoughts by a small hand gripping mine. I looked to my right to find Blair smiling at me. "Whatcha thinkin' 'bout Jakey?" she asked in her usual, playful tone. "Just how good these s'mores are," I said with excitement. "Thanks for bringing the chocolate." She laughed and punched my arm. "You're a bad liar. You know Jakey," she teased me. "No, really, these are great, babe," I replied in between bites. She laughed again and rested her head on my shoulder. We were all laughing about some embarrassing memories of Chase when we heard an ear-piercing screech. My heart threatened to jump out of my chest and into the fire. It was the same screech that the deer had made earlier that day. Aljo and I shared a glance and jumped into action. I grabbed my blade and he his bow and quiver of arrows. We were just about to head out to find Chase when Blair grabbed my hand and looked me straight in the eyes. She didn't need to say anything for me to know she was scared. I looked over at Aljo and only received a nod in response. He headed out while I sat back down with Blair and Corey. He was capable of handling this on his own, and I couldn't just leave Blair and Corey defenseless. I gripped my knife tighter and tighter as the minutes turned to hours waiting for Chase or Aljo to return. Blair tried to calm me down and assured me everything would be okay, but I knew neither of us really believed that. As the sun's light began to cut through the trees, Chase walked back into camp. I jumped up and rushed toward him. He looked toward me, and my steps faltered. For a split second, I thought I saw yellow eyes staring at me from his baggy, sunken-in orbitals. I blinked, and they were back to his normal stormy gray. "I'm going crazy, aren't I?" I thought to myself. "Where have you been?" I asked in a more panicked tone than I had meant to use. "Taking a leak," he said. I thought there was something wrong with his voice, but it was back to normal so quick that I just brushed it off as me going crazy again. Blair came over to my side and asked Chase some questions, but he seemed to be normal Chase. Corey, however, stayed by the now dying campfire. "Where's Aljo?" she asked, fear weighing heavily in her voice. "I don't know," Chase responded, with that weird tone again. I made a mental note to remember that tone shift. Corey took a stumbling step backwards. "I don't believe you," she screamed at him. This wasn't like her at all. What happened to that sweet little woman who was always smiling? I thought. Chase took a lurching step toward her, and I instinctively moved in between the two, gripping my knife with white knuckles. I had seen that type of movement before. He looked me up and down and walked to his tent. Something's very wrong here. Blair and I spent the rest of the day trying to comfort Corey in any and every way we could think of. We made her some more s'mores, gave her a shoulder massage, played games with her on Blair's tablet, but none of it worked. She just kept insisting that I go look for Aljo. I wanted to, I really did, but I couldn't just leave them with Chase. There was just something off about him, and I couldn't trust him. It was almost sundown and Blair was cooking a rabbit over the fire. The sky was a deep pink and the clouds looked blue against it. making it look like a giant sheet of cotton candy. When Blair was done making dinner, I walked to the door of Chase's tent and reluctantly called out, "Dinner's ready." No response. I tried again. Still no response. My patience was wearing thin, so I unzipped the door of his tent. I looked inside, surprised at what I found. Rather, surprised at the lack thereof. Chase was gone, and there was a huge hole in the back of the tent. I had suddenly lost my appetite. The girls ate dinner, and then we all decided to catch up on some sleep and wait for Aljo and Chase to come back. Blair and I went to our tent and Corey to hers. We zipped shut the door and crawled into our sleeping bags. Blair snuggled up next to me as I drifted to sleep. I was awoken by the sound of a screech that sent a shiver down my spine and chilled my blood. I bolted upright and unzipped the tent door, rushing out into the cold night air. The moon was like a resplendent glacier gleaming as rays of sunlight danced through its icy core. I could see clearly in the night, even without the fire, and I rushed over to Corey's tent to see if she was all right. What I found made me almost collapse. Her tent was empty, and in the back was a gaping hole exposing the forest on the other side. I found my knife and sheathed it at my hip. I made to leave when Blair stepped in front of me. "You aren't going alone. I'm coming with you," she said. Who am I to stop her? I told her to stay close to me, and we started off into the forest. My heart was racing inside my chest to get out and escape this damned forest. I dashed through the brush on the forest floor, running for my goddamn life. I had lost Blair a few minutes ago, but as much as I willed myself to go back for her, my body wouldn't stop running. I was in fight or flight mode, and I had subconsciously chosen flight. I kept running until I came face to face with Aljo. I felt relieved at first until I realized that he wasn't blinking. In fact, he had no eyes. Oh God! His cheeks were torn into a permanent smile, his eyeballs gouged out, and ears ripped off, leaving only bloody holes on the sides of his head. I looked down at his body. His right pec had been cut off, exposing his rib cage underneath, his gut agape, with his innards spilling out like a never-ending rope that a clown would use. I turned to run to my left, but was met with the body of Chase, in a similar state to that of Aljo. I stumbled backwards and turned to run the other way, but was met with Corey. What was done to her, I won't describe. I already have to see it every night in my dreams. I crumbled to my knees and threw up what little I had in my stomach. That was when I heard a familiar voice. "Ah, Jakey, you almost got away." I tried to crawl away, but was kicked hard in the ribs. I rolled onto my back, gasping for air and begging for mercy. Blair slammed a knee down on my chest and thrust an arrow through my cheek. I howled in pain as the blood flooded down my throat. My lungs burned for oxygen as I began to drown in my own blood. Blair realized this and gripped the arrow in my cheek, using it to turn me onto my side. She couldn't let me die now. She wanted to make me suffer. She tore the arrow from my face, leaving a bloody hole in my face. She rolled me onto my back again and plunged the arrow into my chest and ripped it down to my gut, exposing my innards. She proceeded to carve out my gut until she could freely peel off the skin and fat, leaving only the muscle exposed. She then stuck the arrow into my eye and began clawing at the exposed muscle of my abs. Every second was enough pain to make me wish I was dead, but I just needed to grab my knife. She grabbed the arrow again and carved Nalii, the Navajo word for property, into my right pec. I felt the cold bone mold handle of my blade and gripped it tight. I brought it up into her eye and dragged it down the side of her face. She recoiled off of me and let out that all too familiar screech and took off into the night. I was found by other campers a few minutes later, unconscious from loss of blood. They had me helicoptered to the nearest hospital. The doctors began surgery right away and miraculously saved my life. You can't trust anyone. I learned that the hard way. Once you trust someone, you become their property. I know because the scars will never fade. The memories will never fade. My pain will never fade, and I will always be that thing's property. Fourth story. There's a skinwalker in my neighborhood. I had heard of skinwalkers before, but always just assumed they were the Native American version of werewolves, so I never gave them much thought. Until last week, when one of the coworkers at my new job told me that they were his most feared folklore creatures. He's originally from Utah, so that makes sense. He suggested some YouTube videos to watch on the subject, and after work that night I binged about 4 or 5 of the videos. I totally understand his stance on them now. I live in rural South Carolina, so to be completely honest, I wasn't too worried about the possibility of running into one. My coworker told me that they're basically a Midwestern thing. I'd be more worried about Wendigos if I were you. He joked the day after I watched the videos. We had a good chat about skinwalkers and Wendigos during our shift and just reveled in the creepiness of them. I mentioned how one of the tales said that the more you talk about skinwalkers, the more they're drawn to you, and he made sarcastic ghost noises to keep the mood light. That night I showed the videos to my fiancée. She was way more creeped out than I was. I became kind of obsessed. I love scary things and couldn't help but watch every video I came across. I discussed skinwalkers with my other horror enthusiast friends, looked up skinwalker art, read true skinwalker stories on Reddit, just dove headfirst into all things skinwalker. This went on for a few days until I started feeling a little burned out on the subject. I live in a fairly nice neighborhood where all the houses are on one side of the street. On the other side is property that used to belong to the local elementary school. The building is on the next street over, so basically it was like the school's backyard or whatever. The school shut down about 30 or 40 years ago, and the county just let nature reclaim the. So directly across from my house is an old chain link fence and just overgrown woods. 2 nights ago, while I was smoking a cigarette, I heard leaves rustling across the street. I didn't bother looking up from my phone. I live across from woods. It was probably a deer. The rustling stopped, then started again, and it sounded like whatever was over there was running back and forth along the fence line, panting like a dog. This caught my attention. There had been a few rabies cases in my town 2 months back, so a strange dog running around in the middle of the night was definitely something I'd want to keep an eye on. I look up from my phone in the direction of the sounds, and they just stop. It was like the thing knew I noticed it. I strained my eyes trying to see what it was, but it was obscured by the overgrowth. I didn't look away, must have stared at the spot for at least a minute. It didn't make another sound, didn't move again, so I knew it was still there. A chill ran down my spine, and I began thinking of every skinwalker video I had watched over the last week, and I felt sick to my stomach. I quickly put out my cigarette and went inside. The next morning I took my dog out for a short walk. She's a pug zoo named Honey and is like my child. Me and my fiancée taught her that pee-pee poo-poo means it's time to go outside to potty. It's the cutest thing. Anyway, this particular morning I take her out to the front yard to do her business. She pees and then walks around sniffing for about 5 minutes before walking to the side of the street and sitting down. She's never done this before, so I was a little annoyed. I tugged on her leash lightly and tried to coax her back toward the house. "Come on, honey."
Oh ah.
She didn't budge. This dog could be stubborn sometimes, but this was something else. She tugged back against the leash and just stared across the street, sniffing the air occasionally. It was then that I realized she was staring at the exact spot that I heard the thing the night before. I got goosebumps and I quickly picked her up and began walking back to the house. As I got closer, I noticed something on the ground by my front steps. It was one of the Halloween decorations my fiancé had hung up on our house. Plastic black roses with plastic eyeballs and spiders on them. The stems were wire, so they can be wrapped around things to keep them secured. This flower was torn apart. Something had come onto my porch, taken down the flower, and torn it apart, leaving it lying in front of my steps. I picked up the flower and threw it away. I didn't tell my fiancée. I didn't want her freaking out. The rest of that day went by uneventfully. That night I told my coworker about what happened, and he looked a little concerned but brushed it off. Said what I heard was most likely just a dog and the flower was probably knocked down by the wind. I had my doubts. As I was walking to my door after getting home from work last night, I heard that same panting as the night before and the clicking of claws against asphalt. I turned quickly to see a dog that looked like a brown mangy bull terrier hauling ass down my street. The street is probably about 40 feet away from my front porch, so I couldn't get a great look at it, but I could tell it was only running on 3 legs because one looked mangled. It turned quickly and darted into the tree line, across the street through a part of the fence that had been pulled back. The fence wasn't like that earlier that day. That's when I noticed that the dog didn't have a tail. I almost threw up. Skinwalker legends say that when they take the form of an animal, they never have tails. I tried to rationalize it to myself. Maybe it just had a stub tail that I missed because it was running. I immediately went inside. My fiancée was sitting on the couch petting Honey. She could see I was upset and asked me what was wrong. I told her nothing, just almost got clipped by a car before I pulled into the driveway. She got up, hugged me, and cursed the person that almost hit me. She asked me if I could take Honey out for pee-pee poo-poo because she had been creeped out by all the spooky videos we've been watching and didn't feel comfortable going outside at night by herself. Honey perked up. She ran to the door and looked between me and the door, whining excitedly. I stared down at her for a moment before agreeing to it. I'll just keep her close to the porch, I thought. We walked off the porch, and she immediately tried to walk to the street. I tugged on the leash, and she tugged back. She eventually moseyed to the edge of the porch and peed. After, she began walking around sniffing. I told her the usual line. "Come on, Honey." "Oh, ah." She huffed at me, sniffed around some more, and eventually started pooping. I was on edge the entire time we were outside, but being around her helped calm me down a little. Then I heard it from across the street. "Come on, Honey." My voice, in the exact same tone and inflection as I had just said it. It sounded staticky, like an old radio broadcast, but it was definitely my voice. Honey stopped what she was doing and stood alert. She looked over to me and cocked her head. "Come on, Honey." "Oh, ah." Again my voice called from across the street. Honey began whining, looking for me to the woods across the street. I picked her up and began backing up to the steps, not taking my eyes off the part of the fence that had been pulled back. "Honey, come." The voice sounded firm now, like it was getting aggravated. Honey squirmed in my arms, whining. I didn't know if she was trying to get out to go to the voice or to run inside, but I wasn't taking any chances. I turned and bolted up the steps and to the door. As I walked inside, I turned one last time to look across the street. There, standing in the part of the fence that was pulled back, was the dog. Its eyes were glowing a dull orange, and it had its teeth bared. The face was all wrong, like someone had taken a distortion tool and just dragged around random features. Once again, I didn't tell my fiancée. Stupid horror movie cliché shit, I know, but I really don't want her losing her shit. I just told her there's a strange dog running around the neighborhood, so to not take Honey out at night. Later last night after we had gone to bed, I woke up to the sound of footsteps pacing back and forth outside my window. Against my better judgment, I rolled over to try and see it. I don't, but the pacing stops. Come on, honey, my voice called out, cutting through the quiet of the night. I prayed my fiancée didn't hear. It called out 2 more times before I heard it walking away. I didn't sleep a wink the rest of the night. Today when I get to work, I'm going to ask my coworker what I can do to get rid of this thing. I'm scared. I don't think there's a way. If anyone knows anything, please let me know. 5th story. My friend's SKINWALKER story. Back in college, a buddy and I were hanging out in our dorm room, smoking some weed and chilling. We get on the topic of creepypastas and stuff, and I mentioned that I've heard some really creepy SKINWALKER stories. My buddy gets really quiet out of nowhere. I saw one, once. Up close and personal. That shit is real, bro. Of course I asked him to tell me more. He said he didn't like talking about it, but eventually opened up. So his story took place back in the summer before he left for college. Him and his high school friend group had planned a big, last hurrah camping trip. He was from Scottsdale, Arizona, and I think he said they only drove a good hour and a half outside the city to one of their friends' parents' ranching properties. There's about 8 people in their group, and everyone shows up around the same time in 3 separate cars. Around when they show up, it's already starting to get dark, so they set up their tents and a campfire and start drinking and smoking. This one dude in their group, let's call him Tim, is being a little more quiet than usual. My buddy asks him what's wrong, and he says something like, "I don't feel good, just a little under the weather today." Regardless, they start making brats and are all having a good time. Then out of nowhere, everyone notices Tim is gone. Just totally vanished. Nobody even saw him leave, even though everyone was relatively close to the fire. The group starts calling his name, thinking he's pranking everyone. Then they start to get worried once Tim has been gone for over an hour. So my friend and a couple others go out into the hills to search for him. They walk around for a good 15 minutes calling his name before they finally get a response. It's not Tim. Instead, they hear the familiar howl of a coyote, and it's answered by a couple other coyotes. My buddy says he was a little worried at this point that Tim might have gotten dragged off by the wild animals. Everyone in their group was paranoid because there's no way Tim could have gone missing without anyone noticing. Just no way. They hear another howl, suddenly. It's longer than the others, and different in that it sounds off, like if someone had a recording of a coyote howling and decided to play it. My friend's blood ran cold when the howl ended in a sort of hacking laughter. And unlike the howl, the laughter sounded close. Like 20 feet away close. The group starts frantically looking around, convinced Tim is out there fucking with them. He isn't. They don't see anyone. They return to the fire a little shaken up. Everyone is really starting to get worried at this point. The group starts considering calling the police when suddenly a truck pulls up to the campsite. It's Tim's truck. Tim steps out of it and is wondering why everyone has been freaking out. Tim says he's sorry. He got off work 2 hours late and hurried out to the ranch as fast as he could. This is when the group realizes that Tim didn't carpool there with anyone. As if on cue, they hear another long, drawn-out howl just like the other one. At that point, the group noped the fuck out of there. They ended up paying to camp in a designated campground, and the night went on as normal. But my friend still says he thinks about when he asked him if he was all right. He claims that at the time he could definitely tell something was off about Tim, but didn't think anything of it. But now he's 100% convinced that Tim was some sort of skinwalker entity impersonating his friend for shits and giggles. How the creature knew what Tim looked and sounded like, well, he has no explanation for that. Maybe it just got inside their heads.